Our dream, I think, is quite simple, and that is to achieve coexistence between people and nature. And we realize that you can only achieve that if you do it at scale.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World with me, Ben Goldsmith, and I'm here with Werner Myburgh from Peace Parks in South Africa, an extraordinary organisation that is focused on creating transboundary protected areas across great swathes of sub-Saharan Africa on a scale that is sort of mind-boggling for me sitting here in the United Kingdom. Werner, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today.
Thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Werner, I think I told you when we met that when I was a kid, I remember watching a nature documentary, and it showed a clip from the 1960s or the 1970s of migrating wildebeest getting caught up against a newly built border fence somewhere in sub-Saharan East Africa. And I was horrified to see these animals up against the fence, kind of crushing each other and presumably dying in large numbers. Peace Parks is fundamentally about removing those physical barriers that crisscross the landscape, is it not?
Exactly, yeah. Peace Parks was created specifically to promote the creation of large protected areas spanning international borders and irrespective of political boundaries or other impediments.
And Werner, it was started by some pretty awesome people, including Nelson Mandela. Would you just give me that story briefly on the origins of Peace Parks? And you, of course, have been there for almost 30 years, which is pretty cool.
Pretty cool. Yeah, it's been an absolute privilege. And I actually, on a number of occasions, had the privilege to interact with President Mandela. He was an absolutely amazing person. But it all started with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Anton Rupert, a well-known South African family. And Anton Rupert had this vision of doing away with political borders and creating scale for conservation. And he asked his friend at that stage, Nelson Mandela, to join and become the patron emeritus and to, through his connections, invite all heads of state of Southern Africa to join this initiative, this movement, which Mandela did. And that was sort of where Peace Park started, is to get this top-down, high-level buy-in of all the heads of state, buying into the concept of a regional approach to tourism and wildlife conservation. And in conservation, bigger really is better. If you think about Kruger National Park in South Africa is world famous because it's a big park, or the Yellowstone in the US. And you need large systems to be able to host and to be the home for these large megafauna. So the idea was quite sound. And we, as a 1997, we were founded, a tiny organization. We were 6 people at that stage. And we went around and spoke, and I joined in 1998, so quite near to the beginning. And we went and interacted with governments and asked them what's their thinking about this idea. So you've got the buy-in politically, but you have to now make this huge vision translate into reality. So we did that, and in the end, we had 22 of these transboundary landscapes identified by the countries, all the countries throughout Southern Africa, subscribing and joining and saying, these are the areas that we think we can potentially collaborate across an international border. So yeah, it's been an incredible journey.
And do you mind listing for me the 5 major landscapes in which you're focusing as an organization today?
So when we started out and we engaged, we got to a formalization level with 10 of these landscapes, these transboundary landscapes. And that means we had the presidents of those countries sign up and agree to a joint shared protocol on the management of natural resources and tourism and security and many other issues. But we as Peace Parks then moved on and we said, well, it's all good and well if you have an agreement and it's on paper, but you have to translate that into practical terms on the ground. So we are currently focusing on 5 transboundary landscapes, measuring about 66 million hectares, which is, to put it in context, sort of 30 times the Kruger National Park, or 30 times the size of Israel, or bigger than the size of France, for example. So it's really, really large land mass. And we are in a phase of our organization for the past decade or so, in those 5 transboundary landscapes, we really focus on long-term co-management agreements. So not only do we think it's important that you facilitate and get high-level buy-in, but it's also critical that on the ground you support operations, you support communities, and you support government conservation agencies to manage these areas optimally. So that means a huge capital layout. And of course, it means it had a massive implication on our budget and our staff. Our head office alone is 107 staff members at the moment. We have about 500 staff in the field. And then we support another 1,200 people that is working in these protected areas or in communities around the protected areas that we are paying their salaries or part of their salaries. So it's, looking at some 1,700 people in total in this initiative at the moment.
So let's just take one of these landscapes, which is the Greater Kaza landscape, which is Angola, Botswana, Namibia. What are the other two countries in that landscape? I forget.
Zambia and Zimbabwe.
Zambia and Zimbabwe. So that's a truly massive area. You got 5 countries needing to cooperate over a huge transboundary park, in which barriers are removed. A lot of the work you do presumably is political. How do you work in interaction with the existing organizations on the ground? Because you've obviously got the governments, but then you've got existing national parks, you've got privately managed conservancies, and a whole bunch of other operators there. How do you, as an organization, how do you fill your niche? What do you exactly do?
How do you do that?
Yeah.
It's massive, isn't it? So, yeah, we started off in 2004 with the feasibility, which we did on behalf of the 5 countries. That led to the signing of an MOU in 2006, where the countries said, well, this is a feasibility, this is the idea and the concept. And it's actually been guided by the governments themselves. And what the governments decided is to create a secretariat. So it's a dedicated staff component that actually drives the process. And so that was created in 2008 with financial support of the German government and Peace Parks Foundation. But that's actually the body, and Peace Parks Foundation became the legal entity for that secretariat, and they then actually drove the process of engagement. What we typically do then on a national level is what we call integrated development planning. So you engage with government, national government, provincial, district, local government. Then you engage with communities, traditional land authorities, and you also engage with all types of landowners, farmers, and of course private sector. And there could be various other land users. So engaging with a multitude of stakeholders to agree on one vision and one plan on a national level. And you do it 5 times. And then the 5 consultative process leads into one, which is called a master integrated development plan. So you do have to, once you've got the political buy-in and support at the top, you obviously have to get the buy-in at grassroots level. And that's what we set out to do. So that's our role. We will facilitate the process. We will help with the planning. And then critically, the next step is, okay, so great. We've got political buy-in at all levels. You've got a plan. How do you go about then to finance it? And that's by working with development agencies, with donors, working with other NGOs, working with the private sector, and then obviously taking hands. This is such a vast area. Peace Parks can't do it alone. And certainly we never thought we will. But it's about partnerships, and it's about working together towards one vision. But it's complex, and we accept it. This is a 25, 30-year initiative. It doesn't happen quickly, but critically, it addresses major ecological challenges in the region. For example, the elephant population or fences that you spoke about. Because of the intervention, Botswana, who had a lot of veterinary fences, agreed to take down some of these fences to actually allow elephants to start moving into Angola and Zambia. So it was a major development and a major positive development for conservation at that stage. That happened many years ago already.
So to what extent does Peace Parks get to do the really fun stuff? To what extent are you and your staff ripping out fences or translocating elephants into suitable habitat from which elephants have been extirpated, that kind of stuff?
So we get involved at a park management level. We sign long-term co-management agreements with governments. That's for us an entry point. And there's various forms of co-management. You can have what we call delegated management, where you say, well, we'll manage the park ourselves, give us the mandate. It's like a concession. Or you can have a technical and financial support. We provide financial and technical support. Our model is actually a sort of a blend of those two, where we created a special purpose entity where we invite government and other NGOs, communities to sit on a board. And this entity then basically runs the protected area. And below that, we appoint a CEO and a management team and all the government ranges reporting to that structure. So in the end, we try to advocate that there's one team, different hats, but in the end, it's one team that gets to work together and protect the area. As a head office, yes, we do get involved in all of these incredible projects. So Peace Parks Foundation, for example, Rewilded. Now that's the reintroduction of wildlife into other protected areas where they were basically extirpated over time for various reasons. Over 18,100 animals as we stand here today. And that includes elephant and rhino and buffalo and cheetah and leopard and you name it. I think we count around 17, 18 species, different types of animals that we've relocated. And typically, let's just take an example. We moved rhino, black and white rhino, from South Africa to a park in Mozambique called Zenaf. And it was 2,400 kilometers by road. And it was a capture team of 150 people that we caught 39 rhino and put them into these trucks and then drove these trucks in this massive convoy for 2,500 kilometers. So through every little town that you go, you had to when we arrived in Mozambique with this convoy, you had the police with this motorcycle convoy in front opening the road. There's no hold up because it was the longest translocation of a rhino by road ever undertaken. So you couldn't waste a single moment at the border post. The border post was just really flung open for this whole convoy. Incredibly challenging roads, and we haven't lost one single rhino, which is, of course, a major success story. So we do get involved in these incredible projects. Moving of elephants is equally exciting, or giraffe, or anything. So it's a real privilege. But I think what really is exciting is, for me, it's more a logistical challenge to move animals. I mean, and we've got the best people, I think, in the world because of their experience of moving these massive animals. You know, elephant bull weighs 5 tons. But once they're there, that's really when the journey begins, right? You have to have a lot of things in place. You know, for example, taking a rhino back to Zenaf, we signed a 20-year agreement with the government of Mozambique to develop Zenaf National Park in 2015. And we only introduced rhino 7 years later, once we were comfortable that there was sufficient security in place and there was sufficient protection. As you know, rhinos are highly vulnerable to poaching for the value or perceived value of the horn. So 7 years after we started restoration of this park, rewilding of this park, and 2,600 animals later, including elephant, only then did we put in rhino. And you only can put in rhino in the park if you've really got everything else very, very well under control in terms of protection, which means you have to have helicopters and you have to have a dog unit, you have to have specialist anti-poaching operations, you have to have a fixed-wing airplane, you have to have the technology backing all of that you can detect any incursion into a protected area. So it's quite an operation. And Peace Parks, as an organization, that is involved in the various facets of providing support. But we've got staff in Zenaf National Park as well, working hand in glove with the government of Mozambique officials.
There must be situations in a transboundary park where one partner is weaker or shorter on resources than another. Is that where Peace Parks comes in and actually does the work for them?
You know, we typically don't do work for anybody. If you teach a man to fish, he can fish for the rest of his life, and that's our philosophy. So we work with governments. We have I'm involved. I'm on the board of the Southern African Wildlife College, which is a sister organization. We've trained over 20,000 rangers in Africa to manage protected areas and to get involved in protection of wildlife. So it's very much a skills development, capacity development process as well. And our model is very much about joint accountability and shared responsibility. So, we focus on areas that have, for historic reasons or other reasons, really only been degraded. For example, there was a war for 16 years, a civil war in Mozambique. And you can imagine the impact of the war on wildlife. I mean, that became the primary food source to feed soldiers for 16 years. So when we started working in Mozambique in a place like Zenaf National Park, which we call the Silent Park, it was quite eerie. The first time I arrived there in April 2015, we were driving around this park, and it was beautiful, these incredible tall trees and grasses. And we were driving around and we were assessing and doing the feasibility, whether we should get involved in signing this agreement. And probably on day 2 or day 3, like something kept bothering me. And I didn't know what it was. And then I realized, but I don't hear a single bird and I don't hear a single insect. Nothing. So it's a beautiful landscape, but it was completely sterile. And 7 years later, and that's the beauty of rewilding and the power of rewilding, 7 years later, when you go there now, actually Zinave has been listed by BirdLife International as one of the strongholds for vultures. And it's just this life that's recovered. And we obviously, with the rewilding process, had ecologists advising us what to do. But because you had these tall grasses, you had these very, very hot fires, and you were actually killing a lot of the tree species. It was completely unnatural. Although it looked beautiful, it was unnatural. And if you go there today, with the elephants back and the rhinos back and the buffalo back, you have a functional system, and you have got insects and you've got birds. I think there's already over 300 bird species that we've recorded now. So it's absolutely astounding with the rewilding of the animals, how this ecosystem starts to function. And I just read an interesting article in the Carbon Pulse the other day, where rewilding habitats offer similar sequestration carbon storage rates than a indigenous forestry restoration project. Can you imagine that? So just by bringing animals back, you manage to store the same amount of carbon than you would by planting a completely new indigenous forest. So it's completely astounding what this impact is on the ecology and biodiversity.
Yeah, this is, of course, is the big awakening that's taken place in the nature movement in the last decade or two. And that is the vital importance of animals and the dynamism that they introduce to an ecosystem. The One Earth Foundation produced a report not so long ago which suggested that restoring just 20 keystone species across their former historic range would have the effect of restoring a third of the world's terrestrial ecosystems. It's super easy. Northern Hemisphere put back beavers and they breathe new life into landscapes. Put back bison onto the grasslands of North America, and the effects are transformational, not just in terms of nature, but also hydrology and, as you said, carbon. So this is why rewilding, I think, is just such an exciting movement. It's about reintroducing those dynamic systems that make landscapes thrive. When we think of the landscapes of sub-Saharan Africa, really we think in a way of elephants, the kind of iconic keystone species and the enormous effect that they have. And I was reading recently a report that suggested that elephants today occupy just 20% of the suitable habitat for them in sub-Saharan Africa, which sort of implies that you could increase sub-Saharan African elephant numbers by 5-fold without creating any new habitat at all. Presumably that can't be done without the kind of things that you're doing at Peace Parks, that international cooperation to establish these huge corridors is the key to that.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely spot on. There is tremendous potential, and that's always the wonderful thing about Africa. In Africa, there's always something new, isn't it? And what we see through this Trans-Frontier Conservation Area opportunities or initiatives is this huge landscapes that are suboptimally used. There's a lot of goodwill from so many stakeholders, including the communities, provided that they benefit from wildlife. And that's the key challenge for us, is to find that balance, that coexistence between people and wildlife. And if you can find that, if you can mitigate conflict, because let's be honest, if you have a maize field and you're somebody living in a rural environment, if an elephant comes this evening and comes into your maize field and takes away your entire crop for the year, your food for a year, that's not something that anybody wants to happen. So to find that balance of rewilding areas, making these connections have to be done hand in glove with communities. And that's why consultation and planning, land use planning, is such a critical part of what we do. So engaging with people on the ground and saying, so what's your vision? What would you see for your future? And how do you see that? And then help them organize themselves into community conservancies or trusts or whatever the case is, to have this foundation of development. And I think something that's often not appreciated is, we're a conservation organization, but we're actually a development organization with conservation outcomes, because such a vast part of our work is to engage with people around these areas. So we're involved in distribution of cook stoves because it reduces your carbon emissions by 70%, but it also reduces the time of young girls and women having to walk 3-4 hours a day to go and collect firewood, right? It's just this efficiency that you bring into the system. So these small interventions. We work with communities on a program called Herding for Health, where they have cattle, but they are in terrible condition. They're overgrazed rangelands where they're occupying. And what we're doing is we help them with what they're currently doing as a livelihood, but just trying to improve by technology or by simple interventions. Like with cattle, we introduced just grazing systems and herders, right? So they used to herd their cattle for the last 500 years in Africa because there were predators around. With the lack of predators, people just started leaving the cattle to walk all over the place. So there's so many things that you can do with communities, but if you don't do that, you don't have that benefit and coexistence that comes as a result of rewilding and conservation, and then ultimately you will fail. So it's an integrated, holistic approach at a landscape level that you have to deal with livelihoods of people and then coexistence with wildlife. And ultimately, if you do all of those things right, which we have done in a couple of areas, you do see people and nature thrive.
How important is voluntary carbon as a source of revenue for these communities? I mean, historically, it's always been about philanthropy, mostly from the West, and also tourism, which of course is starting to boom again since COVID. And those are important revenue sources. But voluntary carbon could potentially eclipse both of those, right?
Potentially, but there's a lot of negative publicity and a lot of skepticism around voluntary carbon, especially the RED mechanism, reduced emissions reductions mechanism, where we talk of avoided deforestation. And unfortunately, that concept has been abused and misused. We're involved in 3 massive carbon projects together with our carbon partner called Biocarbon Partners, spanning over 3 million hectares, one in Zambia, Eastern Zambia, one Western Zambia, and one in southern Mozambique. But what I've seen with voluntary carbon is that just in the very first initiative of 1 million hectares of indigenous forests being protected, 160,000 people directly benefit from it. So it's not only about one wants to keep these indigenous forests intact, but it's also about the massive revenue stream that as a result uplifts their livelihoods. And 160,000 people being directly benefited from forest restoration and protection is absolutely phenomenal if you think about it. I don't know of a national park, for example, that employs 160,000 hectares. That's 160,000 people. That's 1 million hectares. I mean, Kruger Park's 2 million hectares, and they employ only 5,000 people. So carbon is absolutely essential. I hope that there will be a mechanism to safeguard and differentiate between voluntary carbon on the ground according to the gold standard, where it's got a biodiversity benefit, it's got a huge social benefit, as opposed to areas where they sell carbon, but there's an actual no intervention. I'll give you a practical example. Zambia, for example, a country with one of the highest deforestation rates in Africa. There's a lot of corruption involved, let's be blunt about it. And a lot of forests are lost because these bogus permits are issued. And it happens everywhere. It's not only Zambia, it's every country that we work in. So people present these bogus permits, they bribe to get them, and they go into these community areas. They actually pay people to cut down their own trees, and they pay them $2 a day. So it's a really, really sad state of affairs. A voluntary carbon program provides an alternative revenue stream for communities. And instead of paying them to cut down a tree, you pay them $3 a day to protect the tree, right? So if you can economically compete with the logging industry, the goodwill is incredible from people, right? They know it's wrong. They know they're chopping down their own trees, but they are desperate for this revenue stream. So even if there's just parity from a voluntary carbon revenue stream to the logging, which is always paying people a pittance, they make all the money on the import country. There's tremendous opportunity for carbon in Africa through the avoided deforestation, but also through removals projects, right? So where you do rewilding, where you do improve fire management, and actually that's a different measurement. We measure the soil carbon values as opposed to where we're now measuring the delta. In the absence of this intervention, there would have been deforestation. which makes it a little bit more tricky. But there's a massive and a very important place for voluntary carbon in forest protection in Africa and livelihoods of millions of people potentially.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. Would you mind describing for me the dream of Peace Parks? You know, the scale of the land on which you're operating is so great, I find it quite hard to compute. But thinking of elephants, you know, the ultimate keystone species of sub-Saharan Africa, you know, is it possible to imagine that they will be able to move from east to west, north to south, across sub-Saharan Africa as a result of your work?
Yeah, our dream, I think, is quite simple, and that is to achieve coexistence between people and nature. And we realize that you can only achieve that if you do it at scale. If you think of the challenges coming Africa's direction in the next decade, or the next century, actually, you know, by 2050, the population projection is going to be double than it is today. We currently have about 1.2, 1.3 billion people in Africa, and 2050 we will be at 2.4 billion. 2100, around 4 billion people, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, who knows. And you've got this real impact of climate change already visible everywhere. For example, today or this week, we've got the lowest recording of the Zambezi River. That's one of the 5 largest rivers in Africa. Since being recorded, it's got the lowest level ever. And that's climate change. That's the impact of that. So you can imagine how that will impact the future in Africa, where wildlife and people compete for the same resources. And our dream is simply to ensure that people and wildlife coexist. That's a massive dream. And it actually is applicable worldwide, isn't it? I mean, everything we do when we use the sea and the natural resources of the sea, or overexploitation of land for farming, it's not coexisting. It's destruction. So that's our dream. And to put it in a practical, if you have a vision, by 2050, we have 17 potential transboundary landscapes identified by the countries throughout Southern Africa. And we want to have all of them functional. It's a vast area of 98 million hectares. And that's our dream by 2050, is to have all 17 of these transboundary landscapes functional, operational, and where there's coexistence between people and nature. It's a big dream. It's an ambitious dream, but we should be ambitious and we should dream big, and we should be aspirational. And because time is running out, quite frankly, for biodiversity. There's a biodiversity crisis globally. And there's all of these external factors on wildlife, and we always know who will be the loser, right? So for us, it's simply about keep on to invite as many as possible partners, as donors, investors, NGOs, to work together with communities and governments to find that panacea, that future where people and nature can live side by side and coexist. And it's possible, and we've seen it's possible, and not coexist only, but also thrive.
Werner, what is the role of landscape rewilding in all of this? Because Peace Parks is working in some places that are pretty wild. They've been fenced up a bit. They've been stripped of wildlife, and you're putting that back and increasing cooperation among the various stakeholders and nation states to restore these areas. What about between those areas? And what's the opportunity, for example, to convert low productivity cattle ranches back to savanna, or pineapple farms that are suffering as a result of climate change? Is that something that's going to happen, do you think, in the landscapes where you're operating, and more importantly, between the landscapes in which you're operating? Yeah.
Look, as long as the land is there, there's always a way to restore it. I mean, if you think about it, park like Zenov was lying dormant for the last 30 years. So the land was there. It was untapped and unused. And nature rebounds and recovers extremely quickly if you just give it a chance. And I mentioned the example, in 7 years' time, you went from a park where there was no insects or birds to a absolute paradise, thriving in. And I mean, you wake up with bird calls. The other day I was there and I was laying in my tent, and 4 o'clock in the morning I was woken up by a lion. And that lion, by the way, rewilded himself there. He arrived there, we don't know from where. But the point that I'm trying to make is, yes, with the necessary input and will, if the land is there, it can quickly rebound, it can be quickly restored. And if I say quickly, in our scale, 20 years is quickly, right? Nature is patient. Or the planet has existed for a billion years, let me rather say it like that. But so, yes, absolutely. The areas in between, to create corridors, to create interconnectivity is actually what we're focusing on at this very moment as an organization. And working with communities, creating community conservancies, creating areas where wildlife is zoned for wildlife use or it's zoned for cattle use. So it's a lot about planning, and it's a lot about consultation, and it's a lot about benefit sharing. But if you have that recipe right and the right governance model, there's no reason why it cannot be successful, because there's ample success stories already showing the way for us.
Yeah, I had a conversation for this podcast series with Andrea Pavel, who runs Orca, the Orange River Kalu Conservation Area in southern Namibia. And it struck me just how much land is in terrible shape because of activities which don't really benefit people. Now, really low productivity cattle ranching is a pretty good example. And so what Orca's about is buying up these cattle ranches, as the farmers retire or leave, prices are really, really low, removing the fences, restoring the natural hydrology, rewilding species, and effectively bringing nature back to life. Now, it's harder to do if the land is highly productive. You're not going to do that in the Champagne region of Western France. But in cattle ranches in southern Namibia, for example, there's a huge opportunity, I think, to rewild on a massive scale. And I think that's the next frontier, so secure what we've got and make sure it's managed well with good coexistence, remove unnecessary barriers and repopulate existing habitat. But the next frontier has to be to create new habitat where economic uses don't make much sense. And that's what we're focused on here in the UK. Those of us who are passionate about restoring nature and rewilding, it's about taking land out of unproductive use and putting it back to natural vibrancy. Rewilding is really centered around the least productive farmland inside our national parks, former wetlands, and so on. Werner, what you're doing is just completely epic. I feel so privileged to have spent this time talking to you. Peace Parks is possibly one of the most remarkable organizations that exists in the conservation movement anywhere in the world. You've really broken the mold, as I suppose should be expected, given that you were co-founded by Nelson Mandela and a man like Anton Rupert, and that you have the ongoing support of Johan Rupert and members of his family, that these are people that get stuff done. And what I find really exciting is that it's an idea that has started to take root elsewhere in the world. The Jaguar corridor, for example, that runs from the US border with Mexico all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, involves transboundary cooperation of this kind among the countries of Mesoamerica and Latin America. And there are similar transboundary efforts taking place in Asia and even here in Europe now. So I'm really grateful to you, and I love your newsletters. I urge anyone listening to look up Peace Parks and see what they're doing. Your mind will be well and truly scrambled by the scale of some of these places.
Ben, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the support. And that's all we ask, right? Is everybody to do their bit. And I think if we do that, the future really is positive and indeed rosy. So please keep up this podcast series and keep on with the good work that you're doing to make what we do become better known across the world.
That was such a pleasure and a privilege to talk to Werner Myburgh from Peace Parks, an organization which is leading, I guess, some of the largest rewilding efforts taking place anywhere in the world today. The scale of their plans is truly mind-boggling. If you enjoyed listening to the episode as much as I enjoyed making it, I'd be so grateful if you'd go onto whatever platform you use to get your podcasts. Give us a like, maybe a review, spread the word among your like-minded friends. It all makes such a difference in growing the audience for this Rewilding the World podcast series. Next time, I'm going to be talking to my friend and my hero, Charles Clover. Charles is one of the most esteemed newspaper journalists in the UK, and during the last 20 years has also become one of the world's most impactful oceans campaigners. Charles wrote a book called The End of the Line nearly 2 decades ago, and much more recently, Rewilding the Sea, and played a big part in the establishment of the Blue Marine Foundation, an organisation which has helped to establish massive marine protected areas in UK waters and all around the world. I do hope you'll join us.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species, bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.